She wrapped the dog in a blanket. What the animal did next was Miraculous Rajasthan, late afternoon. Near the edge of a dry irrigation canal, the dust had settled into soft ridges where water once flowed. Along the far side, shaded by the coarse arms of a thorn bush, something lay unnaturally still. The shape was unmistakable. A dog curled into himself, ribs sharply visible even through the dirt. His fur was caked in silt and flies clung to his ears and tail. His body barely moved, except for the smallest flutter at his side, not breath exactly, but the memory of one. She saw him from the path, a local woman returning with a half-filled water jug from the farther well. At first, she thought he was dead. Most would have kept walking. Most had. She paused just beyond the thorned branches, keeping her body angled away from the heat, her eyes lowered but alert. Then she stepped down slowly, sandals sinking into the cracked earth, and crouched. He didn't lift his head. He didn't flinch. That was the first worry. She called out once, not loud, just enough to carry to the field's edge where two farmhands sat beneath a neem tree. One looked up, but neither moved. She gestured. Again, no response. Even the wind ignored her now. A second call, softer than the first, and still only silence. She set the jug down and shifted closer, one hand bracing against the rough stones of the canal wall. His eyes were closed. His front leg lay twisted beneath his chest. The fur along his paw matted with dried blood. She didn't touch him. Not yet. Instead, she watched, counted the shallow rise of his chest. 4 slow movements, then none, then one again. The gap between them was growing longer. There were no sounds from him. Not a growl, not a whimper. Just that strange stillness that clung to the dying, like even the air refused to disturb what remained. A single fly landed on the inside of his eyelid. He didn't blink. She stood slowly, brushing the dust from her knees, and looked up the path toward her village. It would be 20 minutes walking, maybe more. Her eyes fell back to the body, to the wound, to the blanket of flies. If she left him, he would die. If she carried him wrong, he might die faster. The sun slipped another inch down the sky. The shadow from the bush no longer reached his legs. The exposed skin had started to crack. She stepped back and picked up the jug. Then she turned and walked toward home. Not fast, but steady. No one on the road asked her why she returned alone. No one asked why she passed her own gate without stopping. When she reached the corner near the old well, she stepped into the yard of her cousin's house and knocked. The door creaked open. She asked for a blanket. Just one. Any kind. By the time she returned to the canal, the flies had gathered in greater numbers. The dog's body hadn't shifted. She crouched beside him again, now with a folded cloth in her lap. Not clean, not thick, but enough to hold warmth. It was only when her hands slipped under his side that he moved. Not fully, just a single trembling jerk from the back leg, the kind that doesn't mean protest, only pain. His body was hotter than she expected. Fever, maybe. She wrapped the cloth around his spine first, then under his chest, folding it carefully across the rib cage. He didn't cry out. He didn't resist. As she lifted, his head fell against her shoulder, limp. If she waited longer, he would die. If she hurried too much, the shaking might stop altogether. She took her first step backward, feet sliding slightly on the loose earth. Then another. She crossed the small ditch, climbed the bank slowly, then turned toward the village again. The dog swaddled in her arms like a child in fever sleep. No one followed. No one watched. But in the dust behind her, a trail of falling flies marked the quiet path they took. The sun hung lower now, casting long strips of shadow between the neem trees and broken fences. Dust curled from the woman's sandals as she stepped off the narrow road and back toward the canal's edge. The old cotton blanket she carried had once been used to cradle pots fresh off the stove. Now it smelled of dry earth and turmeric. She didn't fold it, just held it bundled close to her chest as she walked, her eyes never leaving the thorn bush ahead. The dog still lay there, exactly where she'd left him. But the flies were thicker now. They lifted in slow waves when her steps stirred the air, only to settle again as if nothing living had passed. His sides rose only once in the time it took her to kneel. Not breathing, gasping, and even that too faint to trust. She unfolded the blanket slowly, shaking it once to loosen its stiffness. It drifted down beside him, the faded red edge curling gently against his spine. He didn't flinch, not when she slipped her hand beneath his chest. Not when her fingers touched the warm knot of dried blood along his rib. There was no sign of waking, only heat and weight. Carefully, she drew the blanket around his belly, then across his legs. The corner caught on the thorn bush and tore. She didn't fix it, just wrapped tighter. Her fingers moved gently under his body, checking for breaks she could feel through the cloth. His legs dangled awkwardly. One paw was curled unnaturally under the other, bones too thin to guess whether they still held shape. She gathered him close, arms braced around the folded cotton, and shifted her weight back. A thin sound escaped his throat. Not a cry, not a bark. More breath than voice, soft and incomplete. Still, it was the first thing he'd given. It meant something inside him was still heard. She paused. One foot dug into the slope as she braced herself for the lift. He wasn't heavy, just loose, like a sack that had nothing inside but warmth that didn't belong there. Fever, again, or infection. If it had spread too far, even kindness wouldn't help. But she carried him anyway, holding his weight low against her chest, careful not to jar the side where his ribs had sunk unevenly. Each step up the bank pressed her heel into the dirt, and she leaned forward to stay balanced. The dog didn't move. His nose brushed her arm once, then slid away, limp again. On the road, 2 bicycles passed without slowing. A child stared, but her mother pulled her forward. Still, the woman didn't hurry. She kept her pace slow, adjusting the blanket to cover his neck. Dust blew into her eyes, but she didn't shift her grip. Her arms had begun to tremble, not from weight, but the stillness in her hold. Still too quiet. She crossed into the village at the side lane, where the street narrowed between crumbling walls. Dogs barked in the distance, but not at her. Chickens scattered near her feet, and a thin rope tied across the alley caught the hem of the blanket. She stepped over it carefully, never loosening her hold. Her house was near the far end. A single-room brick shelter with a rusted metal door and a neem tree rooted hard into the wall. She didn't enter. Instead, she turned left toward the shaded corner where her grandmother once kept onions in the cool. There was still space on the mud floor. She knelt and laid the bundle down. The dog did not wake, but his paw twitched once, not full movement, just a slow curl of his toes inside the blanket fold. She sat beside him on the floor, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the cloth. Her voice was almost a whisper. "It's okay, boy." Nothing answered, but the cloth was warmer now than it had been when she found him. That was enough, for now. The road between the canal and the village was not long, but it felt endless beneath the late-day heat. The sun had dropped to just above the treetops, casting a dry orange light that made every shadow look deeper than it was. The woman walked without pause, holding the dog close to her chest, wrapped in the thin cotton blanket that sagged slightly at the corners where his weight dipped unevenly. He didn't move. Not once. The wind picked up across the open field beside her, stirring dust into the air. It clung to her sari and caught in the edges of the blanket, lifting its corners like breath. The dog's head lolled gently against her shoulder, his jaw slack, eyes closed, mouth barely parted. She kept one hand underneath him and the other braced across his back, the way one might carry a child who'd gone quiet too long. Each step sank slightly into the fine dirt path. Her ankles were already coated in dust by the time she reached the first bend. There, a man walked past with a cart full of sugar cane. He slowed for a moment, eyes scanning the bundle in her arms, then turned away. No words, just the soft creak of wood behind him as he moved on. Further up the lane, two children played near the edge of a banyan tree. One pointed, the other stared. The woman did not meet their eyes. She adjusted the cloth across the dog's side, covering a place where the blanket had slipped and skin showed raw beneath. His breathing came in short bursts, nearly invisible now except for the smallest tremble just below the ribs. If she stopped, the fever would win. If she walked faster, his body might give in before they reached shelter. The wind shifted again, stronger now, pulling hair across her face. She paused to tuck a strand behind her ear, never loosening her hold on the dog. Flies buzzed around his hind legs but couldn't settle. The cloth kept them back. The path narrowed near the pond, where an old man sat on a wooden stool with a cracked radio beside him. He glanced up but didn't speak. His eyes lingered on the bundle and then dropped to the ground, as if what she carried wasn't his to acknowledge. Her feet hurt now. Not from distance, but from the uneven weight and the strain of keeping balance on dust that gave too easily. The dog shifted once. Not movement, just a deeper sag against her elbow. Still silent, still breathing, but barely. As she reached the final curve before the village entrance, she passed 3 women returning from the temple. One touched her own wrist lightly, a quiet gesture of concern, but none stepped forward. The woman carrying the dog gave no sign of noticing. Her eyes stayed forward. Her pace never changed. At the boundary wall of the village, the wind finally softened. The air turned heavier, and the smell of cooking smoke curled low along the street. Her gate was ahead, a wooden frame tied with rope where the latch had broken last season. She didn't stop there. Instead, she turned into the narrow alley beside it, where the shadows were deeper and the ground cooler beneath the feet. She stepped into the shaded yard and lowered slowly to her knees, the blanket still wrapped firm. The dog didn't lift his head, but the faintest breath of heat touched her arm. Still alive, still with her, and in the dust where she had walked, a perfect line of footprints trailed behind her. 2 sets, one hers, and one where the blanket had dragged lightly through the earth. She stepped over the low threshold of her home with care, one foot steadying the other as the door creaked against its hinge. The dog's weight had grown heavier with the quiet, not from strength, but from the stillness that clung tighter the longer he didn't stir. She crossed the room without speaking, only the sound of her bare heels brushing the packed mud floor, and turned toward the wall nearest the small kitchen shelf. The corner stayed cool through most of the day, shaded from the sun and lined with flat stones pressed into the earth by decades of use. She knelt slowly and lowered the blanket-wrapped form onto a faded jute mat, keeping one hand beneath his neck until he was settled. The moment her touch left him, his body slumped sideways. There was no tension in the muscles, no sign of waking. But when she smoothed the cloth across his back, a single sigh escaped. Shallow, drawn from a place just above silence. A clay bowl sat nearby. She filled it with well water and placed it near his nose. The scent did nothing. He didn't sniff, didn't stir. She moved a small plate of rice closer, crumbled with soft pulses, barely salted. Still no change. His body remained curved unnaturally, legs folded beneath his frame as if his bones had forgotten their use. By late evening the room had darkened. Thin threads of smoke drifted in from neighboring cook fires, mixing with the scent of ash and turmeric that lingered from her own meal. Untouched. She sat beside him, legs drawn close, one elbow resting lightly on her knee. Her other hand hovered just above his back, not touching, just near, as if proximity could substitute for comfort. Outside, the street had grown quiet. A cart rattled by once, a dog barked in the distance, answered by another. but within her walls the only sound was the low hum of the lamp as she lit it, its wick catching after a single breath of fire. The flame flickered softly, casting long shadows across the mat where he lay. The folds of the blanket rose and fell so gently it was hard to tell if he breathed at all. She leaned forward and whispered something faint, not meant for him to answer, not meant for anyone to hear. A sound more than words, just enough to acknowledge that he hadn't left. The hours passed slowly. She didn't move from her place beside him. The bowl of water remained untouched. The food cooled and hardened. The wind outside shifted direction once, and the thin curtain lifted for just a moment before settling again. Then, not long after midnight, something changed. His eyes opened. Not fully, just enough to show a sliver of dark beneath the lids. He didn't blink. He didn't turn his head. But the movement was real. And after a moment, so was the second. His paw curling ever so slightly, a weak tug of muscle under the blanket's fold. She didn't reach for him. Instead, she sat still, letting the quiet hold them both. If he closed his eyes again and didn't wake by morning, there would be nothing more to do. But if he kept them open, even once more, she would stay. She would keep sitting through every hour he remained between sleep and leaving. The lamp flame crackled once and steadied. His eyes closed again, but she had seen them open, and that, for now, was enough. The first light of dawn crept through the narrow slit above her door, casting a pale stripe across the kitchen wall. Outside, the village was still. No footsteps, no animal calls, only the faint rustle of wind across clay rooftops. Inside, the air remained heavy with sleep and smoke. She hadn't moved from the mat. Her legs had long since gone numb, folded beside the dog who still hadn't stirred since the brief flicker of his eyes the night before. Then, a sound. Not loud, just a small, rhythmic tap, dull against the hard earth. She turned her head slowly toward it. His tail had moved. Once, then again. A hesitant lift and fall. Nothing strong, nothing certain, but it was there. The first deliberate gesture since she found him. She leaned in, shifting her weight forward to see better. The blanket had slid slightly, revealing the tip of his spine and the fragile curve of his ribs. The tapping stopped, but his body remained just a little less still now, his side rising in uneven breaths, one slightly stronger than the last. She reached for the clay bowl again and filled it with fresh water from the covered jug. A slow pour, careful not to spill. Then, without speaking, she placed it close, just near enough for the scent to reach his nose. His nostrils flared once, then went still. She waited. He didn't move, but then, with a weak twitch of his neck, his head shifted a finger's width. Not much. Barely enough to notice unless you were watching closely. She was. And so she saw it. A moment of effort, drawn not from strength but instinct. A turn toward the source of coolness, the nearness of relief. She placed her hand near the side of his jaw, not touching, just letting the warmth of her presence remind him he was not alone. His eyes fluttered, a single blink, slow and dry. The lids didn't open far, but they opened, then closed again as if the effort had used more than he could afford. He didn't drink, not yet. But his tongue flicked once against the edge of his lip just enough to catch the faint scent of water hanging in the air. She moved the bowl slightly closer, the rim now brushing the blanket's edge. He didn't resist. That, too, was progress. If he moved again, even slightly, he had a chance. If he stopped, the body might begin to harden by evening. The air inside the house warmed quickly with the sun. Dust particles floated in golden shafts, slow and suspended. The woman stood briefly, only to stretch her legs. She returned moments later with a thin piece of cloth and dampened it with the rest of the water. Gently, she dabbed it along his ears and across the sides of his paws, wiping away dirt and fevered sweat. His skin flinched beneath her touch, the first reflex she'd seen, and then, Without warning, his head lifted, just slightly, barely more than the height of her thumb, but it was not dropped or falling. It rose on its own, held briefly above the mat, then lowered again in one tired arc. She exhaled softly, the kind of breath you release when you've held it too long and didn't realize until the silence breaks. She reached out and touched his head, just once, her thumb smoothing over the rough fur above his brow. "There," she whispered, voice low and almost lost in the morning air. "There you are." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The blanket shifted as he breathed, and the room, for the first time since his arrival, felt shared. The third morning brought no change in the sky, pale and quiet, with thin clouds drifting across the sun. But inside the small house something moved, a rustle of blanket, the scrape of claws against the floor. The dog stirred. He had shifted before, small movements of breath, the slow turn of his head, but this was different. His legs, long and too thin now beneath the folds of the blanket, twitched with purpose. One front paw dragged forward, nails clicking faintly on the stone. Then the second. He didn't lift himself. Not yet. But there was weight in the motion, an attempt. She noticed from her place by the hearth where a small pot simmered over embers. Without speaking, she set the ladle aside and crossed the room. He had pulled himself a few inches from the mat, the blanket half tangled beneath him. His ribs shifted with each breath, sharp under the stretched skin, and his eyes were open, wide now, alert in a way they hadn't been since the canal. She knelt beside him, hands hovering near his side. He tried again. This time, his body rose an inch, elbows trembling, back legs folded uselessly behind. Then he pushed higher. It lasted only a second. His body collapsed, front legs sliding out, chest thudding softly against the earth. But he didn't cry out, didn't whimper, just lay there, panting, as dust settled back around him. She reached out and touched his neck, her palm flat against his skin. The heat had lowered, still present, but no longer scorching. His head turned toward her hand, slow and uncertain. The gesture was small, almost missed, but it meant something. He knew her now. She repositioned the blanket beneath his belly, folding it into a cushion. Her fingers traced lightly down his spine, pausing near the base where the muscles twitched again. No breaks, just weakness. Days without food, days with fever. Bones leaned too far from flesh. If he tried again too soon, he might tear something inside. If he stopped trying altogether, he would never walk. She placed a shallow bowl of warm water by his nose, soaked lightly with rice starch. His tongue flicked at it, barely touching, but it was more than yesterday. When he finished, he rested his head on her foot. Later that afternoon, he tried again. A single heave of muscle, stronger this time. He pulled his chest off the floor, wobbled, and managed to hold it. His back legs dragged awkwardly behind him. He stood on only two limbs, barely, and shook. His whole body quivered, eyes locked on the door. Then he collapsed again, slower this time, more controlled. She didn't speak, just ran her hand across his shoulder, smoothing the fur that had begun to grow stiff from rest. A fly landed on his ear, and for the first time, he flicked it away himself. Evening fell with a soft breeze, curling around the frame of the doorway. She lit the lamp, and its low glow reached the mat. He hadn't tried to stand again, but his head stayed upright for longer now. He watched the flickering light, blinking slowly, ears twitching at distant noises. She sat beside him with a small bowl of lentil broth and dipped her fingers into it, offering drops on her knuckle. He licked them off, not with hunger, but trust. Outside, a cart rolled past. A rooster called once from the neighbor's yard, but within those walls, healing had begun. Not with medicine, not with words, but through the quiet repetition of presence. In the soft hush of that third night, his tail tapped the mat again. Just once, but it was enough. The seventh morning was warmer than the rest. The clay outside had begun to dry into cracked lines, and the wind came in short, dusty bursts through the courtyard. Inside the house, the woman stood by the doorway, her hands resting lightly on the wooden latch of the gate. She hadn't opened it in days, not since she first carried him through it, fevered and weightless. But now, something has shifted. The dog, once a shadow of breath and bone, stood behind her. He had begun to rise on his own that week, not steadily, not without faltering, but with intent. Each day brought more weight to his steps, more certainty in the way his feet found the ground. His legs still bent unevenly, and he walked with a limp that would never leave entirely. But the stillness was gone. And with it, something else had returned. His presence. Full and quiet. She unlatched the gate and pushed it open with one hand. It creaked as it swung, the sun spilling across the threshold in broken shapes. Dust lifted in lazy spirals as the door settled back. The dog stood just behind her, head tilted slightly, ears forward. He did not rush toward the light. He waited. She stepped aside, letting the open gate speak for itself. If he chose to leave, she would not stop him. His paws met the stone edge of the doorway, and he hesitated. The wind touched his face. He closed his eyes for a second and inhaled. Not a deep breath, but something close to remembering. Then, slowly, he walked forward. His front legs moved first, strong but cautious. The back ones followed unevenly, dragging slightly in the dust, but keeping pace. Each step was measured not from fear, but from care. The blanket had long since been folded and set aside. He wore nothing now but the thin frame of recovery and the marks of old wounds barely closed. He crossed into the courtyard and stopped, just at the edge of the sun. The road ahead was quiet. A few goats stirred at the far end, and the scent of cooking lentils drifted in from a neighbor's window. He looked toward it, then turned his head. Not toward the noise, toward her. She hadn't moved, her hand still rested on the edge of the gate, and as he looked back at her, his body shifted. Not back into the house, but toward her feet. He approached slowly and reached her hand with the tip of his nose. The touch was gentle, a nudge, more felt than seen. He held it there for a moment, then stepped back, lifting his tail in a motion that had not come for many days. Not high, just enough to show it remembered how. Then he turned again and began to walk. Not far, not fast, but forward. Each footfall light against the earth, each movement steady in its own right. She didn't call him, she didn't follow. Instead, she stood quietly and watched as he reached the edge of the alley and paused. His ears twitched once. A cart rolled in the distance. He glanced back, not seeking permission, just letting her know he still saw her. Then he moved on. The gate remained open behind him, and the soft dust of his steps left small, curved prints along the edge of the path. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed loosely, and listened to the slow fade of his movement into the light. Healing, when it comes, does not announce itself with sound. It arrives quietly. One breath, one blink, one step, until the miracle is not that he walks again, but that he paused to say goodbye. Winter arrived gently in the village. The mornings grew sharper, the air thinner, and smoke from the cook fires clung longer to the rooftops. The leaves of the neem tree above her home dropped slowly, one by one, drifting into the courtyard like careful reminders of time. And the dog, once limp and breathless in her arms, had stayed. He never left the village, not fully. Some days he wandered toward the pond where boys fished, or down the alley where leftover rice was swept from cooking pots. But he always returned. By dusk he would settle near the fire pit outside her doorway, paws tucked beneath him, eyes half closed as the evening cooled the earth. She never called for him, never needed to. At sunrise he appeared without fail beside the well. She would arrive with her metal pot balanced on her hip, and there he'd be, sitting just far enough not to be in the way, but close enough to meet her glance. His tail, now full again and curved slightly at the end, would thump once against the stone. Then he'd walk beside her, one step behind, back through the narrow lanes to the house. He did not chase carts or bark at other dogs. He did not beg. His pace was slow, deliberate, shaped by old injuries that left a slight twist in his gait. But there was lightness in his movement, a calm certainty that belonged only to the ones who had once been close to vanishing and somehow remained. When the wind blew cold through the alleyways, she wrapped her shawl tighter across her chest, and he, without prompting, would press his side against her knee when she sat, offering warmth without request. He did not seek her lap, or her hands, or food from her plate. Only nearness. Only the memory of that first cloth, the thin cotton blanket that had once held his failing body together. He now claimed no space as his own. Not the threshold, not the courtyard, not the quiet kitchen corner where she sometimes dropped soft lentils on the floor. Yet every place he touched became gentler by his presence. The steps, the wall, the shadow beneath the neem where he slept in the afternoon sun. Children sometimes followed him. They would try to name him, offer bits of bread, or whisper strange sounds. He would sit, watch, and walk away without offense, never frightened, never eager, as if names no longer held meaning for something that had already been returned from forgetting. Months passed like this, one still day into the next. The scar near his side faded beneath new fur, and the limp in his back leg grew less pronounced. But he never ran, never rushed. His life now moved with quiet rhythm: fire, water, step, rest. And when the nights fell hardest and the cold curled under the doors, she would sit near the fire pit wrapped in her shawl. He would come then, lie beside her without a sound, and rest his head against the hem of her cloth. The blanket that saved him was folded now on a shelf inside, frayed at the corners, stained near the edge, but every morning when the sun stretched its first light across the mud floor, he glanced once toward the door before rising, as if remembering, as if still grateful. He stayed because he had been carried, and sometimes that is all the reason a life needs,